I was glad to be permitted to give this talk tonight on a theme that I chose because it just seems so timely. Catholic radicalism in the age of Trump. But I just want to launch in, and I'm hoping that I'll finish in 45 minutes or so, and we'll talk. We'll talk till 8 o'clock. There's a lot to talk about these days. The thing I want to talk about first is November 8th, 2016, A Night to Remember, to use the title of an old movie on the sinking of the Titanic. Who could ever forget this night? I remember many consequential election nights, but none like last November. After the voting, after voting on the way home, I teach at Regis University. On the way home, I voted. And then I continued, got home, grabbed my dinner, brought it downstairs. I'm not usually permitted to do this. But my wife said, okay, go ahead. And plopped myself in front of the television for a night of polls and predictions and pundits who were calling it the election for Hillary Clinton. And as the evening wore on, my certainty about the election result was, at first, around 7:30 p.m. Mountain Time, suspended. And then at 8:30, my certainty was diminished by a sense of unease. And then at 9:30, it was called into serious question. And then at 10 p.m., it was challenged. So I consulted the New York Times website, where its prediction had turned around from a confident 87% chance of Hillary Clinton winning to a stunning 95% chance that Donald Trump will win this election. Like many Americans, I went to bed that night somber and in the same mood when I awoke, in what seemed to be a different country, or at least a different era for our country, and now we know what it is. It's the age of Trump. We see that phrase all the time. Not long after, David Remnick of the New Yorker reported on how Obama and the outgoing White House staff were dealing with the reality of President-elect Trump. The title of the article was, "It Happened Here." The reference was to a novel by Sinclair Lewis, It Can't Happen Here. Published in 1935, the novel tells the story of a fascist takeover of the United States, not unlike the ones that were then underway in Italy and Germany. The unlikely candidate who beats Roosevelt in the 1936 election is Buzz Windrip, a populist authoritarian fashioned after the Louisiana governor Huey Long. The unlikely hero is an editor of a small-town Vermont newspaper by the name of Doremus Jessup. He is comfortable in his offbeat, at times cynical, jaded, at other times nostalgic worldview, and only gradually does Jessup perceive the dangerous marks of Windrip's presidency: the demagoguery, the hyper-patriotism, the methodical consolidation of power, the elimination of opposition, the thuggery, the murders, the concentration camps. And eventually, after some waffling, he is moved to action. He joins with other dissenters and publishes a seditious underground newspaper called Vermont Vigilance, dedicated to exposing the crimes and corruptions of the American corporate state and patriotic party. For this, Jessup is sought by the authorities and must flee to Canada while the Windrip government dissolves into anarchy, the future of the country dark and uncertain, the ship of state sinking down. This was one of the many signs, this editorial in the New Yorker, of renewed relevance of the book, It Can't Happen Here. And in the weeks after the election, sales of the book skyrocketed, and it was soon republished as a Penguin classic. Now, I admit that there's a part of me that hesitates to refer to the administration by deploying the F word in conversation and debate, because it can be a cheap shot. Fascist, the F word, or Hitler, or Nazi, and political cognates like that. Conjuring up images of brown shirts roughing up lefties and Jews in the streets. And these can be showstoppers that don't clarify a situation or lay bare the real issues at stake. Still, we shouldn't avoid these references altogether, for it's politically and morally important, I've long thought, to draw analogies between our own practices and beliefs and those associated with Germany from 1933 to 1945, or more broadly, with Europe from the early 20s to the end of the Third Reich. Indeed, people and groups in our society have been drawing analogies like this for weeks now. In fact, just this week, the New York Review of Books came out with an article on a biography of Hitler, and it draws the parallels between Hitler and the Trump presidency, taking all the cautions to note, but then going ahead. But we've been drawing these analogies for decades. Take, for example, the parallels between the Holocaust and abortion. In 1982, an essay was published in a book titled Rachel Weeping by Jim Burchell, under the title Die Buben sind unser Unglück. The babies are our misfortune. A tweaking of the popular Nazi slogan, Die Juden sind unser Unglück, the Jews are our misfortune. The article noted parallels between the depersonalization of the Jews in Nazi Germany and the depersonalization of the fetus that comes with abortion in the United States, along with a host of other legitimating practices. The euphemistic language describing the process, in both cases, evacuation, cleansing, removal, transfer, solution. And to make comparisons between eugenics-based rationales used by bureaucrats of the Nazi regime for cleansing society of undesirables, and the justifications for not bringing into the world children that are unwanted. Given that a sizable number of U.S. citizens view abortion as unjustifiable, it isn't surprising that the label fascism has been used in our moral and political discourse for quite some time. Take another example. Scholars, journalists, and activists have long noted that a culture of fascism surrounds U.S. military policy and the construction and use of weapons, particularly nuclear weapons. This is true concerning atomic and nuclear weapons according to the authors such as Richard Rose or Chicago's own Gary Wills. It's also true concerning conventional weapons that were used, for example, during the Vietnam War, which we know was shrouded in secrecy and deception thanks to Neil Sheehan, David Halberstam, Seymour Hersh, and other reporters, as well as the New York Times itself when it published the Pentagon Papers, the top secret files that Daniel Ellsberg turned over in order to expose the malfeasance at the highest levels of the U.S. government. The word fascist as a description was used a lot during the Vietnam years. And it's a description that fits not only for the U.S. role in Vietnam, but also in the Cold War at large. The secret operations, the assassinations, the installation of the Shah of Iran in the 50s, the Bay of Pigs fiasco in 1961, the coup in Chile in 1973, the covert wars in Central America from the 1950s to the 1980s, and so on. And similar policies and operations continued beyond the Cold War. The first Gulf War, the invasions of Afghanistan and Iraq, and more recently, military interventions throughout the Middle East and beyond, which we know about thanks to the journalist Jeremy Scahill, author of Dirty Wars and the Assassination Complex. which tracked the expansion of the war on terror and the use of drones for extrajudicial assassinations by the Obama administration. On this score, we must note fascist features of the US government's surveillance programs as well, which have been exposed thanks to whistleblowers like Julian Assange, Chelsea Manning, Edward Snowden, and their journalists, Laura Poitras and Glenn Greenwald. Not long after the election in The Intercept, I highly recommend The Intercept for reading what's going on politically in this country. Greenwald pointed out that the dangerous expansion of presidential powers by Barack Obama is now at the disposal of the Trump White House. When Trump's press secretary, Kellyanne Conway, cited alternative facts to justify her account of all things, the inauguration crowds, commentators pointed out the Orwellian character of the new administration. Sales of 1984 skyrocketed as well. More copies purchased than at any other time in its unbroken publication run starting in 1949. But in fact, if we're honest, Big Brother has been watching long before Trump burst onto the political scene. Wealth and economic inequality is another area in continuity with, rather than sharp departure from, pre-Trump era politics. Without downplaying the drastic cuts in benefits and entitlements coming, we must note that deep tax cuts and cuts in social programs came also in the Ronald Reagan years. Newt Gingrich was running the House. And again by President Bill Clinton, who dismantled what was then known as welfare. Presidential and congressional elections have long been decided by the wealthy and the super wealthy, the advertising and public relations companies that they hire. Jill Lepore of The New Yorker looks back on this pattern and says it's been going on since the 20s. Granted, it's been more problematic in the wake of the Supreme Court decision Citizens United in 2010, releasing unprecedented amounts of dark money into the campaign process. Dark money, a phrase coined by Janet Meyer in her book, Dark Money. But the dark money has been operative on both sides, from the likes of Grover Norquist and the Koch brothers, but also in the spirit of bipartisanship, I want to point out George Soros and Mark Zuckerberg as well. And just on March 27th issue of The New Yorker, Jane Meyer pointed out, she has an article called Trump Money, and he's got dark money from a hedge fund operator called, by the name of Robert Mercer. Immigration is a worry with Trump as president for obvious reasons. The drastic executive orders on travel and refugees entering the country, the stepped up ICE activity, the promise of a wall. But even here, it should be remembered that the record year for deportations is still 2012 under Obama. This may change by the end of this year, of course, but immigration restrictions were not invented by Trump. They were in place during much of the 20th century, since the 1920s, with the tragic result that Jews fleeing Nazi persecution from Eastern and Southern Europe were refused entry into our country because the percentage caps had been filled. Also, we should remember that the haunting lament by Woody Guthrie for the 28 migrant workers from Mexico who died in the plane crash of Los Gatos. You won't have a name when you ride the big airplane. All they will call you will be deportee. It's a great song, written in 1948. Immigration quotas were lifted in 1965, certainly a change for the better. But I remember while working with the homeless in Phoenix in the 1980s, the sanctuary movement getting underway. And I remember how our guests from Mexico would run out the back door when they saw La Migra coming in the front door. Much the same can be said about racism, which is likely to get worse with Trump, already has in many ways. But Black Lives Matter started several years ago, under Obama, not with Trump. A similar point can be made concerning the environment. Trump policies will be more detrimental than Obama's. They promise to be a disgrace, a disaster. But neither Obama nor Bush before him, nor Clinton before him, and on, did enough to address the dire warnings of James Hansen or Bill McKibben about the environment. Trump will make things worse. But we all make things worse with our lifestyle choices and catalog of needs, such as air conditioning and bottled water and smartphones. My overall point, the one that I've been pressing toward, is this. Trump does not represent a simple and sharp break with the past, but rather in key aspects, a continuity with the past. That the fascist features of his presidency have not sprouted up suddenly, but have emerged gradually. That we have evolved into our present political situation, not a revolution, but an evolution. That what has arrived with the age of Trump has been arriving over the course of decades, we could say a century or more. In short, to paraphrase Sinclair Lewis's novel, it's been happening here for a long time. That's my first point tonight. My second point is that we don't see it, we Americans, because of our partisan politics. But that as Catholics, we're supposed to see it, to see these trends and be alarmed by them and to protest them. And yet we don't see it because we Catholics are also deeply involved in partisan politics. And these are a function of our national commitments, our nationalism, or our Americanism. Trump uses this word to sum up his approach to politics. He said it one time, Americanism over globalism. But this word has special meaning for Catholics, and if we plumb this meaning, we will find the cause of the moral and political blindness we have suffered for decades. And this is what I would like to do in the second part of my talk about Americanism. And then the third part, addressing the issue of blindness, I would like to suggest that it can be cured by an alternative stance or story or a tradition called Catholic radicalism. So, our Catholic Americanism. The first thing to note about Catholic Americanism is that the Church in the United States has been, from the mid-19th century on, by and large, a church of immigrants. The Irish, the Germans, the Italians, the Polish, French Canadians, Mexicans, Slovaks, Lithuanians, Ukrainians, Eastern Rite Catholics from Russia, Central Europe, the Middle East. I lived with a bunch of Eastern Rite Catholics when I was here in Chicago out in Logan Square. They have a church there, Romanian Catholics. They came to the United States, they're still coming to the United States, in vast numbers. They accounted in 1916 for 75% of the Catholic population in 1916, just under 16 million. The great challenge during the height of Catholic immigration in this country, from 1840 roughly to 1920, was that of assimilation, becoming American. And the church played a central role in this process, especially on the parish level, where the ethnic identity of Catholic immigrants was preserved through bonds of faith and community, while they could also work hard, raise families, move up the socioeconomic ladder, and learn to embrace their newfound identity as Americans. This is what sociologists say the church helped people do. In a secure setting, become American and learn that. In the parish. It's the history of Chicago. A train ride, you know, on the L, and you just see the history in the steeples that still mark the skyline. John Tracy Ellis, a dean of American Catholic historians in the latter half of the 20th century, referred to this assimilation process as Americanization. And by this he meant Catholics becoming Americanized in the political and cultural sense. That is to say, they moved into the U.S. mainstream, into public life. And Ellis notes that Catholics became deeply Americanized to overcome their strong immigrant identity, their foreign language, their foreign customs, their foreign religious beliefs and practices, because they moved into the Protestant kingdom. I'll never forget, looking at Bill, we'll talk about a mutual friend in Durham. When I was there in the 90s, I had to move an apartment, and a bunch of people helped me move my stuff. And one of them was Holly Jones, who's from North Carolina, a Methodist from North Carolina. And she was just really kind of puzzled by Catholics, especially Catholic priests. And I remember as we were moving things in, she was telling me how to set up my apartment. She said, "So, oh look, Mike, you can put your chair over here, and you can put your lamp over here, and you can put your television over here, and up here on this shelf you can put all your idols." That's us. That's Catholics. We have a foreign religion. And Catholics overcompensated, so to speak, by becoming very American and becoming politically the most loyal of Americans, fitting themselves into a nation that viewed them as not really belonging, as not really American at all. But Ellis viewed this Americanization process not only in sociological and psychological terms, but also in intellectual terms, in historical, political, and philosophical terms. He held that the United States of America offered something to Catholics that was not offered to Catholics in any other nation in the world: religious freedom. And to grasp the significance of this claim that was made by John Tracy Ellis and a host of scholars who were working at this time, Catholic scholars, we need to look at Americanism as an idea, as a movement, and as an intellectual tradition within Catholicism in the United States. And to do this, we need to step back and broaden our purview to take in the political situation of the Catholic Church in Europe during the 19th and into the 20th century. Set against the backdrop of the French Revolution, the situation of Catholics was bleak indeed. A protracted political struggle was underway throughout the 19th century, I speak especially of France, between two opposing forces. On the one hand, the forces of monarchy. On the other, the forces pressing for democratic reform or violent revolution. The Church's reflexive response was to side with the forces of monarchy, on the supposition that this was the only political arrangement that could preserve or restore the religious and moral foundations on which a genuinely just social order rests. Given the virulence with which the Church was persecuted in the French Revolution, this response was understandable. But the relationship between the Church and the claimants to monarchy in France was hardly congenial. The Church was not free under Louis XVI, before the French Revolution. And the Church was by no means free after the French Revolution under the Emperor Napoleon, nor under the restored regimes of the Bourbons, nor under the successors of Napoleon. And the same was true throughout Europe. Kings wanted to control the Church for their own political purposes. But democratic reformers were even more hostile to the Church, so that throughout the 19th century, the Church was compelled to negotiate through compromise agreements called concordats. And they had to negotiate for control over matters that, according to their traditional principles of canon law and civil law, and according to its own doctrine, politics, church, and state, the church had a rightful jurisdiction over. The clearly religious matters of worship, clerical training, and the appointment of bishops. The idea was that church should be free to do this. But kings wanted to control this. And the so-called mixed matters over which the church and state share Jewish jurisdiction, such as marriage and education. As the 19th century wore on, things looked increasingly bleak. These compromises that the church made were not made in conformity with Catholic principles, but rather as an expedient way to just live under a situation not under your control. This is where the doctrine of toleration of evil came from. And the church just had to live with a situation it hadn't created, but would negotiate with different political forces for some freedoms. But as the century goes on, it's looking worse and worse. In 1870, Victor Emmanuel's troops toppled the Papal States, and the Pope protested by insisting on being a prisoner in the Vatican. Later in the decade, Bismarck, having already consolidated the states, German states, into an empire, he launched a Kulturkampf, a cultural struggle against the church, placing it under virtual siege. In Austria-Hungary, a Catholic country, and its Catholic emperor, Joseph II, whittled away at the power of the church over its own internal affairs. One of the things that he insisted on, it's interesting to note, was that homilies should be limited to 10 minutes. Oh. He was going, I think that was a plug to get popular support for his monarchy. And in France, eldest daughter of the church, the seesaw struggle between restorationists favoring monarchy on the one hand and Republican forces favoring secular democracy on the other were tilting in favor of Republican forces, especially with the establishment of the Third French Republic in 1870. In general, looking at the long curve of history, Europe was in the final phases of a centuries-long process of modern state formation. In this modern state system, the church would have at best an indirect and more a marginal political role, and in some cases, hardly any role at all. There was no political space within which the Catholic Church could have its long-standing sway in public life and enjoy the rights and privileges that had been protected for centuries, since the Middle Ages, under the principle of libertas ecclesiae, the freedom of the church. Looking at the European situation from the outside, Catholic leaders in the United States believed that they had a fresh and monumentally important perspective to offer. The main figures here, Catholic leaders in the United States, were Cardinal Gibbons of Baltimore, de facto head of the church in the U.S., Archbishop John Ireland of St. Paul, Father John Kane, founding rector of the Catholic University, and Dennis O'Connell, rector of the North American Seminary, and their agent in Rome. Their agent because these were the Americanists. And they precipitated what historians call the Americanist crisis. Their vision was messianic. Their purpose was world historical in scope. They said, in America, the church is free. Government doesn't attempt to control the church. The state limits itself in order to free the church to pursue its mission. Building on the worldviews of two mid-19th century predecessors, Orestes Brownson, the great editor and essayist, and Isaac Hecker, founder of the Paulist religious order, these Americanists believed that there existed a fundamental harmony between Catholicism and America, a providential fit between church and nation, which meant for them that America could, get a load of this, be converted to Catholicism. And in order to do that, they argued, the church should adapt its teaching, always in non-essentials, never in dogma or doctrine, to the exigencies of what they called the age. This way, Catholics in America would lead the Church Universal in guiding and shepherding the nations of the world into this new democratic era in history. Toward this end, the Americanist Party favored several progressive pastoral initiatives that were controversial in the 1890s, such as allowing Catholics to join the Knights of Labor, which was a secret society and it was prohibited. Supporting state-funded and operated schools, secondary schools. John Ireland was famous for this. Establishing the Catholic University of America, which opened in 1889 and was meant to be a progressive Catholic place of scholarship. Prohibiting ethnic or national, mainly German national parishes. Promoting interreligious cooperation, especially with the World Parliament of Religions in 1893 and other initiatives. Moreover, these Americanists worked to spread their vision abroad in Europe, especially in France. Their efforts were opposed by conservatives, some of whom were associated with German churches in the United States, all of whom were more cautious about adapting and fitting into America. The controversy raged within the American Catholic Church for a decade and a half, from 1884 to 1899, until Pope Leo XIII put an end to it with his apostolic letter, Testem Benevolentiae. He condemned Americanism. And in condemning Americanism, it had little to do with the progressive political efforts and initiatives listed above. It had more to do with the figure of Isaac Hecker, a biography of whom was published in France and which was stirring up strife there between royalist and Republican French Catholics, we might say right-wing and left-wing Catholics in France. And Leo didn't want controversy at that time, and that meant he had to condemn Americanism, which had been published in this book that everyone was reading, because he was trying to negotiate with the French government so that the Catholics could retain their schools. So people look back at this historically and they say, well, that was a phantom heresy. It had more to do with France than what was going on in the United States. But at the same time, Leo, very craftily, affirmed what he called political and cultural Americanism as part of what Catholics owe and enjoy to this they enjoy in their country. Gibbons, Ireland, and their associates were thus free at the turn of the century to pursue political and cultural Americanism. And they did. As we have seen with the Americanization of Catholic immigrants in the 20th century, and also with the propagation and development of the primary idea of Americanism, the idea that Catholicism and America are in fundamental harmony. There exists a harmony between church and nation, that America is, to use Isaac Hecker's phrase, a providential nation. A divinely appointed instrument through which God will bring to all nations justice, peace, and freedom, especially religious freedom. That's Americanism. By the time of World War II, when these Americanists died, I'm thinking here of Ireland and Gibbons, they had promoted these themes. And after, World War I, And after World War I, this theme became the dominant effort among Catholic scholars throughout the 20s and into the 30s. They believed that a political shift had occurred in the world, and that Germany and Europe no longer was the center of political power, that it had shifted to America, and that America would have an important role in the world. Catholics were poised to contribute to the political and cultural life of this nation. And for the next 50 years, it's fair to say, this vision was propounded by Catholic intellectuals, philosophers, historians, political theorists, economists, sociologists, in classrooms, in colleges and universities, in newspapers, in magazines. It's right here at DePaul. It's in the bricks. It's in the archives. It's just here. It's our history. Among these scholarly exponents of Americanism in the 30s and into the 40s were refugees from Europe fleeing fascism. Heinrich Rahmann, Yves Simon, Bill's friend Jacques Maritain, and others. But the most important figure here along these lines was an American, John Courtney Murray, who took up the task of showing European Catholics that the militant secularism of the French lay state, as it was called, did not prevail in the United States. Rather, the United States was governed by a moderate liberalism, that of British constitutionalism, which called for a separation of church and state, and did not expel the church from public life. It was free to enter public life. And in fact, this was the vision that shaped, according to Murray, the U.S. founders. Murray argued that the founding fathers of the United States were unwittingly employing the political thought of Thomas Aquinas, building, as he put it, better than they knew. It's a phrase that comes from Orestes Brownson. And that Catholics could therefore fully participate in the United States. And as the 40s and 50s and into the 60s wore on, they did. Most dramatically when President John F. Kennedy was elected president. It's just an amazing idea that that a Catholic would be president of the United States. At the end of Vatican II, with the promulgation of the Declaration for Religious Freedom, this all but vindicated this Americanist vision. John Courtney Murray penned the document, and the story of Catholicism in America seemed finally resolved, as if the plot line were that of a comedy. The relationship between the two main characters is thwarted by obstacles that seem insuperable, but then, through a remarkable chain of unlikely events, the obstacles are overcome. All's well that ends well, and there's a marriage banquet at the end of a comedy. But in the 50 or so years since Vatican II, since the death of Murray, which would be 50 years this August, since Catholics were finally free to enter fully into U.S. politics, the plot line of the story, I'd suggest, has moved from a comedy to a tragedy. That is to say, rather than the tensions in the story resolving, the tensions have remained and deepened and cannot be overcome. The goal cannot be reached. The tragic hero reaches for a goal that he can't attain to. First, because Catholics have found that the United States does not heed, say, the prescriptions of Catholic social thought based on the natural law in any number of areas: abortion, war, economics, euthanasia, racism, the environment. And second, even more tragically, because Catholics themselves have become increasingly divided over these issues, divided into liberal and conservative Catholics. The trend actually developed and deepened just after Vatican II with the 1968 election. And they've remained ever since. So that the division is between liberal and conservative Catholics, between Democrat and Republican Catholics. And this is a tragedy. But a tragedy, if it is continually, repeatedly reenacted, becomes not just a tragedy, but also it becomes a farce. That is to say, the goal can't be reached, but the characters in the story don't know that, so they keep repeating the same mistakes again and again and again, like the Keystone Cops who keep on running into each other. And I would want to suggest that we've seen over the last 48, 50 years, the tragedy of American Catholicism becoming a farce. And if anyone wanted to doubt the farcical nature of Catholics in U.S. politics, just look at the history. 1983, the bishops write a pastoral letter on war and nuclear weapons that is ignored by the president and by half the Catholics themselves. 1986, Economic Justice for All, a pastoral letter that's called for restructuring the economy, and it too was ignored. 1995, abortion is condemned, euthanasia, capital punishment as part of a culture of death. And yet, the practices continue and expand. And then the 5 non-negotiables in the 2000 election. Catholics being recruited into the Republican Party by the likes of Karl Rove. The wafer wars of 2004 over who should be barred from communion, when, where, and why. The Obama at Notre Dame debacle in 2009, at which I was present. And then this last election, which one would think should have decided it, when Catholic prelates and priests and political pundits urged their flocks to vote for Donald Trump as a pro-life candidate and someone who will fend for the freedom of the church. Donald Trump, the bishop our bishop in Denver, virtually said, you got to vote for Trump if you're a serious Catholic. This is the guy that started casinos in New Jersey and appeared on the Howard Stern show. And other Catholics of rank or no rank point to Hillary Clinton as the one to preserve the republic. Both candidates are so deeply implausible as representatives of Catholic social teaching, CST, as it gets called these days. But Catholics don't see this, not clearly enough anyway, and it's because they're horrified by the alternative that they're opposing, by the political opponents on the other side. In this sense, Catholics are most perceptive and trenchant about Catholic social teaching when they're criticizing the other side for failing to grasp and embody it. But this only further invests people in the political process because the priority must be placed on preventing the looming catastrophe, Trump's policy on the environment, Clinton's attack on religious freedom, and so on. And so we become blind to the full range of Catholic social teaching. And the only cure I want to suggest is a critique of the Americanist tradition itself, which has to come from outside of it, a competing tradition, a tradition of Catholic radicalism. And this is the third point that I want to make. At the beginning of my talk, I said that I voted before heading home to watch the election returns. I didn't say who I voted for, but I'll tell you right now. I voted for Ralph Nader, my write-in candidate since the year 2000. That was the year he was accused of torpedoing the election of Al Gore and winning it for George Bush, even though Nader responded by pointing out correctly that more Democrats left the Democratic Party for Bush than left the Democratic Party to vote for him. It was a failure of the Democratic Party. I like Nader. He tells the truth. He works with facts. He says that corporations control both parties, that both parties have no real legitimacy. He fears the demise of democracy in America. I fear that too. I find that Nader's sense of homelessness in U.S. political culture is one that Catholics should, and I think in large part, do share. Which is not a coincidence, because Nader's a Catholic. He's a Maronite Catholic. But I want to go further than Nader would go, further to the left, to the old left, and to the revolutionary wisdom of Leon Trotsky, who was a critic of socialism, thus would be a critic of both Ralph Nader and Bernie Sanders. And his critique of socialism is summed up with this sentence: where they sought to win the state, they got won by the state. In other words, to rephrase it, those who set out to win the state get won by the state. Those who set out to manage the politics of the state get managed by the politics of the state. The quote from Trotsky is taken from the autobiography of Dorothy Day, The Long Loneliness, who 100 years ago was working for the New York Hall, and she interviewed Trotsky. Only weeks later, she reported that she went down to Union Square to hear Trotsky speak when he declared, "Revolution is brewing in the trenches." And indeed, it was. And Trotsky hurried back to Russia to play his part in the Russian Revolution while the whole world was watching. At length, after Lenin was long gone, Trotsky realized that the revolutionary project of the Soviet Union had been turned into a vast, heartless, barbaric bureaucracy, where decisions to do evil were routinely made on the basis of expediency, some form of utilitarianism, justifying present evil for the sake of some future good. Freedom, equality, humanity, the revolution, the republic. Trotsky was murdered by agents of Stalin. He ended up with an ice pick in his head. It's a tragic story. For reasons that are captured in the Dorothy Day quote that I just recalled, those who set out to win the state get won by the state. Dorothy's life was devoted to revolution too, a personalist revolution, a green revolution, a revolution of the heart, as she called it, a revolution that was both Catholic and radical, and very much non-Americanist, in the way that I've discussed the term. She didn't think that America was a providential nation. With her Marxist background, she was able to see something that Alasdair MacIntyre, who also has a Marxist background, has helped us to see. That what we call the modern state is constituted by bureaucratic arrangements designed to maintain systemic injustice in favor of the powerful and the wealthy, promising value to its citizens in return for devotion and sacrifice. At times, ultimate sacrifices, dying for the state, and also, as Bill Cavanaugh has pointed out, killing for the state. It does this, the state does this, by claiming to be the guarantor of our rights and liberties, including religious liberty, and generating or manufacturing, as Noam Chomsky points out, our consent. This is what Chomsky calls the we fallacy, a syntax that creates the illusion of consent and participation. Who are we going to elect? What are we going to do about Putin? What are we going to do about North Korea? What do we do about ISIS? But if what MacIntyre says is true of the modern liberal state, then the story of the church in America must be altered, and the church in modern politics must be altered. Just as the church was held captive by the monarchical state in one way, and by the secular lay state another way, so the church is held captive by the modern liberal state in yet a third way. And the primary way in which it is held captive in our era is by dividing it into left and right, into liberal and conservative, binaries that divide Catholics and render them blind to the realities with which I began my talk: abortion, militarism, economic equality, mistreatment of immigrants, racism, across the board, and so on. In fact, these things we've been blind to for a long time. What I think the age of Trump offers to us is an invitation to embrace Catholic radicalism's deep skepticism about the modern state. My point is that electoral politics makes all of us into utilitarians, making compromises, little concordats in our heads, which say, oh, I'm going to vote for him, I support him because it's the lesser evil. And we tolerate these lesser evils. And so we live under a regime that's analogous to the two regimes that dominated the church in Europe in the 19th century. And I would say that in our situation now, this idea of a providential nation has been rendered implausible with this last election. And that it really calls us to consider the importance of building a new society within the shell of the old, to use Peter Maurin's phrase that he got from the IWW. Or another way of doing it, thinking of Catholic social ethics as guided by a philosophy that's so old that it looks new. And it seems to me that the Catholic worker, Dorothy Day, Peter Maurin, and others, embody this tradition and has to contend with what I think are is one of the strangest criticisms of the Catholic worker and of this Catholic radical tradition, that somehow it withdraws from society, that it's sectarian and closed off, that it's not public, it's not politically engaged. Whereas in fact, the Catholic worker from the beginning was heavily engaged in the politics of reform. The first issue of the Catholic Worker newspaper had an article on the mistreatment of blacks in black laborers throughout the country. The first issue attended to the issue of race. Not long after, the Catholic Worker led protests at the German consulate in New York City over the mistreatment of Jews under the Nazi regime. At this time, Peter Maurin was disseminating his easy essays on the importance of Jews in salvation history, taking a page out of Jacques Maritain's writings. And also, the Catholic Worker declared neutrality. This is what I'm opting for. Neutrality in the Spanish Civil War, refusing to side with the fascist regime of Franco in Spain against the Republicans or communists who were fighting the regime and persecuting the church. It just said, we're going to be neutral on this. Very controversial at the time. And let's not forget, the Catholic Worker, by 1940, was publishing a paper with a circulation of 190,000. Politically engaged. In 1940, Dorothy Day testified before Congress in opposing conscription, inciting a protest of clerics in the church who tried to shut her down. In 1941, as the United States entered World War II, she declared, our manifesto is the Sermon on the Mount, but also declared, we love our country, especially for welcoming immigrants over the centuries. In 1945, out of love, she wrote a moving editorial condemning the use of the bomb on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. My point is that Dorothy Day was entirely engaged in the public issues of the day, but she was engaged tactfully and tactically, based on principles, but not endorsing any political party, and in the process sacrificing those principles. She wrote in one editorial called, We Are Un-American, We Are Catholics, in the Cold War, 1949. She bemoaned the execution of the Rosenbergs. She protested civil defense drills in the 50s, and she wrote upbeat dispatches during her visit to Cuba. And at another point, she decried the Vietnam War. She was a political activist, but she was not a partisan activist. The Catholic Worker has no party line. By which I mean that, what I mean is that we need to be involved in this kind of politics ourselves, getting more involved in politics, becoming more literate in politics, reading the newspaper, reading books, talking with people about politics, calling for political reforms. But the challenge in all this is to be perceptive enough and pragmatic enough not to fall into the already established grooves of political partisanship, which means voting on a case-by-case basis for very specific reasons and thought-out reasons. For example, I waited until 6 p.m. to vote on November 8th because I wanted to see if Hillary Clinton was really going to win by a longer margin, a wider margin in Colorado. Had I learned that she might not, I might have reconsidered my vote, because it might have tipped the election if Colorado went red. That's the type of casuistry that I think we need to engage in. I don't know if I would have. But I knew I had to wait and decide again based on the best information. I voted for Ralph, as I said. To vote for a particular congressional representative in 2012, for example, because he supported veterans' rights in the Indiana 2nd District. To vote for a particular mayor in a particular city, in a particular era of that city, because he's good on issues of race and will do well with Black Lives Matter. It means being ready to make a discriminating judgment, such as favoring Neil Gorsuch as Supreme Court Justice, because of one's belief that religious freedom of the Little Sisters of the Poor is being attacked by the federal government, something I believe, by misconceptions, misreadings of the First Amendment. On this I side with John Courtney Murray. But in saying this, I also recognize and state that I think Roe v. Wade is an injurious decision. But I also think the second most injurious decision in the history of the courts is Citizens United. So I don't know where I'd fall on Neil Gorsuch. You've got to make practical, careful deliberations. What I'm suggesting here is that we make judgments that avoid political cliches. We must wage a war against cliches, not be taken in by partisan politics, by slogans such as, "She'll keep us united together," or "He'll make America great again." It's too much like what they said about Wilson in 1916. "He'll keep us out of the war." 5 months later, 100 years ago tomorrow, the United States entered the war, in the Great War. So what I'm suggesting is that, what I want to say is that one of my fears about this particular political moment is that Trump will lean heavily in the direction of political recklessness, incite a nuclear attack by North Korea. This is the theme this week, right? Every week it's a new crisis. Or a conventional war with Russia over the Baltic states, send the globe in a chaotic direction. But another fear I have is that the country will adore Trump, that he'll have his wings clipped, and then the Democrats will sweep the 2020 elections and bring back the kind of policies that Obama and Clinton have pursued with a vengeance. Activist, expansionist, war in the Middle East, economic favoritism to big corporations and global markets, government dominating and supposedly expanding further in the supposedly free institutions of civil society, and it will seem more normal than ever. The phrase will be, back to normal again, back on track, dump Trump. You can hear the keyboards clicking already. And we also have to be ready to engage in resistance, by which I mean the kind of civil resistance, civil disobedience that Dorothy Day engaged in. In her acts of civil disobedience, her refusal of paying taxes, her non-cooperation with military conscription, the kind of civil disobedience brought, exemplified by Daniel Berrigan, who brought the term resistance into the discourse of American pacifism from his experience in France working at the end of World War II. The context of German fascism and the Nazi analogy is instructive here. And there are exemplars in this regard. The confessing churches in the Barmen Declaration, Hans and Sophie Scholz and others of the White Rose movement, whose leaflets calling for resistance to the Nazi repression got them executed. Franz Jägerstätter, the martyred conscientious objector of Austria. Dietrich Bonhoeffer, Edith Stein, and others, who maintained their integrity during a difficult time and who were able to resist the political dynamics that led to that dark time and to act accordingly, refusing to cooperate with a government that many people did not see as problematic. Declaring sanctuary when they round up immigrants is something that cities and states and communities should do. All of this is to be done in a spirit of apostolic tradition that goes back to the apostles. And we ourselves are an apostolic church not only because our lineage goes back to the apostles, but what the apostles enacted is reenacted by us. And it's in that spirit that we ourselves are called in this time to be a genuinely apostolic church in this age of Trump. Thank you.
Hi, I have a question. By the way, I'm college professor here at DePaul, and they've got department, different approach. But anyway, in terms of political perspective, so your main idea is that this division has been in America for a long time. But my concern is that maybe during this time, especially under the Trump administration, has become even more radical, the division. And I wonder if that is something that concerns you. And then you mentioned something about moderation. You kind of, it seems that you don't like much that term, the implication of that. Would you agree that maybe we need more moderation in political discussion rather than radicalization?
I would agree with that, especially when you're talking about electoral politics and so on. And in a way, I suppose what I'm trying to say is that we will moderate our discourse and really talk to people. You know, we all have family members. It's hard to talk to my sister, who voted for Trump, and she assumes I vote for Hillary Clinton. But it's our investment in the outcomes of these political elections that generate the animosity and the acrimony. And that if we keep those outcomes more out of our mind and look more carefully at solutions, we can avoid some of these patterns where people will just lob to one side and then, you know, repeat the divisions that are on the news and that are in the papers and so on. It just seems to me that it's just very unusual today to say, you know, I'm really support immigrant rights and I'm pro-life. This is becoming a more difficult thing, and I think that the fact is that many immigrants are pro-life too. And that we neglect these realities in favor of these groups, these partisan battles. I don't know if that helps answer your question.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I'm a graduate political science from this university, and I'm just wondering if you concur with Professor Gordon. I was at a seminar a couple weeks ago, and he suggested that Putin funds all the neo-fascist parties in Europe.
I don't know if, I would want to see the evidence, I suppose. I wouldn't be surprised if he does. If I were Putin, and I would do it. Because I think he's trying to, with some of the analysis, is he's trying to break up the European Union, which will give him more sway in that part of the world and so on. That sounds plausible to me. What's the point in your question?
Because I didn't realize before going to that seminar that I was under the impression there's only a couple, like two neo-fascist parties in Europe, and he said there's every country in Europe has a neo-fascist party, which I was not aware of.
Yeah,
I understand the movement, but I didn't understand it was that widespread.
Yeah, I wouldn't be surprised. I imagine there are different strengths and so on, but this is a big year for elections in Europe, right? France.
I have one more.
Yeah.
Would the academic community be more amenable to Trump if Steve Bannon wasn't involved? Well,
I'd be more amenable to Trump if Steve Bannon was involved, and he just got taken off the National Security Council today, as a matter of fact. That's a good sign. But what are we to make of that? I think the National Security Council scares me, even with him not on it. And that's, I feel like, what we get blind to is the deep state and these dynamics that have become more visible and show that there's more dark forces controlling our politics than we've been willing to imagine.
thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Baxter. I wanted to comment your paper, and this whole presentation was simply outstanding, and I have to ask a question. I'm thinking myself as a publisher. The title of your speech is Catholic Radicalism in the Age of Trump. And then you're concluding, and I think is the real message of your speech, Apostolic Capitalism in the Age of Trump. So it is very catchy to say radical Catholicism.
Yeah.
Is that really the issue here? And I agree with everything in your paper. Catholics have to understand the radicalism of their own religion just as much as they have to understand the radicalism of their own secular politics. And I have to ask a question in this apostolic tradition. We're making value judgments across borders of countries. And what is the position in such a large Catholic country as Mexico about how Catholics are treated there by their own government, where that is really the issue in a global apostolic way? In other words, the Americans are doing everything they can, but there might be a tension in the Catholic Church that we're maybe doing more than what other Catholics in other parts of the world are doing, even at the bishop level, to solve the issues of property, to solve the issues of injustice. And maybe it's as simple as the bishops in those countries don't want to be martyrs because they're going to be killed by their own government, and we know that's happened. But I think the radicalism has to be defined in terms of Catholicism on a global basis and not by the leader of a particular country. And that's just, I think it's, everything in your paper is simply outstanding on that. And I think the publishers will love the title you chose. It's just, it's more about apostolic Catholicism and not radical.
You know, I'm Elizabeth, Bill mentioned this subtitle of this book I'm working on. Catholic radicalism as a phrase troubles me a little bit because it sounds like a label, and look at us, we're so radical. And that's a bit of something that troubles me. But I like the label because it works as a contrast to the water that so many of us are swimming in. And I guess I like it too because Dorothy Day in that tradition is by now known as radical Catholicism or Catholic radicalism. And the Pope loves Dorothy Day, and I love the Pope. And I didn't mention Pope Francis in this argument because I didn't want to just invoke him against, make him another player in this. But I think that what you're pointing out is something that Francis wants us to see. And that is, there's a big world out there. It all just doesn't revolve around you Americans. And I think that's, in a way, what is at the heart of my argument. And it's a good reminder.
Mike, I think some Catholics in America might say the looming crisis at hand is something to do with religious liberty. And the group I'm thinking of would tend to frame this around questions of marriage equality and debates around that.
Yeah.
This group perhaps might say, well, no, actually, the question or the crisis that's looming may have to do with religious liberty, but it may have to do with our ability to support and protect, for example, our Hispanic families. If the latter is the more likely crisis, I wonder what you think the impact of that might have on churches and the Catholic Church in general in this country in terms of finally kind of galvanizing us around some of the issues you're talking about.
I think it would be a great development if Catholics saw their duty to resist any mistreatment or deportation or removal proceedings of immigrants and would stand up and somehow resist it. It's very hard to think of how those scenarios would unfold in practice. At Regis University, a bunch of students are calling for Regis to become a sanctuary campus, right? Like other schools have done. And the president said no, he's not going to do that. And I wish the president had said yes, we are going to do that. But then, what does that mean? Like, it's very hard on the people who declare sanctuary, for the actual people who have to live in the particular church grounds or whatever. And there's a lot of practical situations and scenarios that we have to think about if we're going to come to the aid of people who are under threat of deportation. But I'm for those discussions to find out better how we can be a church that resists the intrusions of the government. It's just a complicated question. Just to step back, Colorado is a big religious freedom state these days, and the courts have been ruling on religious freedom issues. And I am just dying to further persuade lawyers that I know who work with the Becket Fund in Washington and so on, in Colorado, on the basis of religious freedom for the Little Sisters of the Poor. And take up those arguments for religious freedom regarding parishes that want to declare sanctuary. That's a religious freedom issue too. And that conscientious objectors who are against a particular war, but not totally pacifists, have no rights in this country, but that's a religious freedom too. And again, we look at religious freedom in one way, and we don't see the broad application of these principles. And I think that's because we get so politicized. Hey, wait, don't you have a question? No.
I do, but I'll wait for him.
If you want,
No.
So Mike, you gave an account of this kind of pragmatic sort of voting that, you might under these circumstances vote for this candidate, other circumstances
Right.
vote for. I mean, isn't that what your Archbishop in Denver would say he's doing, when he all but says you need to vote for Trump? He's saying, I'm not a Republican, I'm not a Democrat, I'm not necessarily a Trump fan, but I'm looking at what are the most important issues, and I think abortion is the most important issue, and so I think that we have an obligation to vote for Trump. So that's the first part of the question. I mean, isn't that exactly what people will say, given their circumstances, whether they're voting Republican or Democrat? And don't you want to say? I mean, so what else is there besides voting? I mean, you talked a lot about voting. Is that all we can do, or what else can we do?
I think that is what Archbishop Aquila is doing, but I fear that he doesn't fully admit that that's what he's doing by the way that the text reads in the instruction. This is an important issue. I think we should participate in politics, electoral politics in this careful way, and in other forms of politics in very vigorous ways. But we have to do it in such a way that we remain detached from the ideological story that gets told about our participation. We're Americans, America is special. I mean, in a way, what I outlined here was a Catholic version of American exceptionalism. And I think that we have to learn not to tell ourselves those stories. Because those stories, I think, when they take on their partisan forms, are what blind us. And I think the bishop is making a prudential judgment, but I think he's blinded because we haven't, for example, heard word one about immigration in Denver. And we should be. There's a Unitarian church that declared sanctuary in Denver. Where are the Catholic, you know what I mean? And I think that that's because he leans in that way and he's learned to think only and see only some things.
I'm thinking of other exemplars, and I'm thinking of an exemplar particular to this building and to this space, Monsignor Jack Egan. So what would Jack say in this time? I think there's some things he was involved in when it means about being church and politics. That how would you connect his vision with what you're calling for as an apostolic church? I think good to know because he's part of this.
Right outside there,
it's right
although
outside.
It doesn't look like him at all.
Yeah, I know, it's a terrible version of it, but I'd love to hear your thoughts in this message of an apostolic church.
I kind of said hello to Jack on the way into the building. I don't think he would like what I said. But I look at it generationally. I loved Jack Egan, and he was a friend of mine. he lived in that generation that I described as coming of age. That's his story. And he, in terms of like being a Catholic, coming of age, participating in American politics, he did it. And he did it well. And the city, the whole city of Chicago is great, should be grateful for that. But he was a liberal, political liberal. And he would never have voted Republican. And I would want him to be more conflicted than he probably was at the end of his life, into the 90s. And he just looked at conservative Catholics as just crazy out to lunch. And he shouldn't have. And I think we would have had an argument about that, but hopefully it would be a good one, because he's such a giant. Man, but that's what I see. I think that's where he'd be.
Second question. What do you tell church in Chicago? We're about to go through this big Redo My Church effort, which is going to involve a massive change, looking for mission vitality on a large scale in the local communities. I work for the Archdiocese, so full disclosure. Asking an old friend and a teacher an important question though, like, we've called, and it's named after the movement of the call that Francis received to rebuild my church. So what might that look like here? You've lived in Chicago, you know Chicago. I'm curious in this framework of this apostolic movement, what does that look like when we also have this massive infrastructure that we're reckoning with? I don't know how many ways to ask the question. I guess I'm just curious. Right. We're at a very important stage, a very critical stage.
And you're talking about the parish reorganization.
Yeah, the reorganization. We have an opportunity actually to do some very big systematic things that could also have, because the parishes are being grouped in small little clusters, and so it's a local. The idea is to ask the local community. I mean, so there's some different ways that we're trying to restructure and ask the local communities what they're looking for and how do we become church. And what would you, I guess your talk would be the message to the church, but how would you specifically look at an archdiocese trying to make some changes in the face of the fact that we have this infrastructure that's part of the inheritance of the Americanist tradition?
Yeah, I would say get some money. One, I got Steve Maurin. Get some money. First, get $1 million. Then, no, there's a lot of money in Chicago. And so these parishes that have to close, turn them into houses of hospitality. I'm sorry, I'm such a hopeless Catholic worker type, but I think about this all the time in Denver. The house burned down in Denver. They're without a house, and the prices in Denver, real estate, are exorbitant. They're like Chicago, but it's Denver. No one has the money. And there's these, but there's these buildings. All you need is, there's going to be 25 parishes that close down. There should be 25 houses of hospitality, and get some of that dark money that's going into these elections, and get these Catholics back and say, you know what, refurbish these buildings, and we're going to do real work in it. And then there'll be DePaul graduates, and we're going to start a program where they can pay off their loans if they go do this for 4 years. And I mean, I'm convinced there is a way to do these things in ways that are really creative, really sustainable, and financially doable. There's an incredible amount of money that's being, like, what are the totals of the election costs? It's just a scandal. And the biggest donors are, a lot of the biggest donors are Catholics. And they shouldn't be doing this. They should be opening churches and letting they worry about young people who are turned off by the church, aren't interested. Well, it's not very interesting unless you can do something real with your life. And I feel like this would be a great thing to do. All you need is $100 million. And but is it doable? I feel like Pope Francis could hit people up, and you know what they said about Jack Egan? Jack Egan knew where the money was and knew how to ease it into the service of the kingdom. That's what we need, are people that can dedicate their skills toward these good ends. And I'm convinced that it would be possible. Now, everyone will think you're crazy if you say that, but
There you do.
yeah, but I somehow, I just believe this is possible. I've just seen people give money and time, unbelievable.
Well, that's more on houses of hospitality in every parish.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. We need parish homes, not parish domes, right?